The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Syndicate Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, this is our first show of the new year, the year of the tiger. I want to wish everybody a happy Chinese New Year or a happy Lunar New Year, depending on where you are in the world. It's been very quiet out here in Vietnam as everybody is stuffing themselves and watching lots of TV. All the stores are closed. Everybody's taking a well-deserved rest. So again, we want to wish everybody a happy New Year as well. And also a big thank you to our Patreon community, all of our Patreons giving us wonderful support. We've got some more Zoom calls coming up, and we do a weekly digest that goes out every Friday. If you would like to join our Patreon community, you can go to patreon.com/China Africa Project. Our next big event coming up on Patreon is we're going to introduce our Patreon members to our new team members who are running our Francophone and our new Arabophone sites. Our new Arabic and French sites are coming out, so we're going to introduce our Patreon members to those editors coming up well before everybody else. So if you'd like to join that, again, patreon.com/China Africa Project. Also, just before we get started in today's show, I want to give a shout out to one of our followers on Twitter, Mark Hoffer, who called me out actually for a comment that I made last week about Chinese sanctions and the fact that they hate sanctions. And he rightfully pointed out that the Chinese may hate sanctions from the United States and the United Nations, but they are more than comfortable at dishing out sanctions of their own. And he pointed out that right now, the secondary sanctions against Lithuania because of Vilnius permitting Taiwan to open up a representative office is a great example of their use of sanctions. Also, the fact that China has thrown all sorts of sanctions against Australia for a number of different reasons. And back in 2010, the Chinese were very quick to sanction Norway for the Nobel Prize Committee's award of the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. So again, absolutely right. Thank you, Mark, for keeping us honest and for pointing out the hypocrisy of China criticizing U.S. sanctions when, in fact, it does the same thing. Cobus, today we're going to be talking about infrastructure, loans, financing, debt. It has been a really interesting week in this space. I want to point everybody's attention to the folks at Bloomberg who have just published another one of their stories in the Congo hold-up investigation. Remember, we had William Klaus and Michael Kavanagh from Bloomberg on the show back in December. They've just published another report, this time about a public-private partnership road that was built, and it shows you the interesting dynamics of corruption and infrastructure. So we're going to try and provide more details on that maybe in the next couple of weeks when we focus on the DRC. But today we're going to focus on Nigeria and also what's going on in Kenya and the discussion that's going on around the world right now about infrastructure. And Cobus, we wrote a story earlier this week about Nigerian Transportation Minister Rotimi Amaechi, who what I described as saying the quiet part out loud. Here's a quote that he gave to Nigeria's The Guardian newspaper. He said, quote, "We are stuck with lots of our projects because we cannot get the money. The Chinese are no longer funding." Now, this is a truth that we have known for quite some time in this space because we've been following what the folks at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center have been tracking as well, that loans from the two major policy banks, that's the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank, have cratered going back to 2016, starting at $75 billion back then. Then 3 years later, it went down to just $4 billion. And what we've seen in Africa is since the standard gauge railway, they have lost the appetite for funding big multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. And it looks like Amaechi is just now acknowledging that. He is the first major minister to do so, to be so blunt about it. and that the good days of easy access to Chinese capital are now over.
I guess. I mean, it's on the one hand, I agree with you that obviously the Chinese Exim Bank and Chinese Development Bank funding has created, and it is, I think, useful for African politicians to acknowledge that. On the other hand, that lending came with a ton of debt, kind of that Africa is now trying to deal with. And it's also not 100% true that the financing has stopped. It's more that the financing has shifted. It's shifted to other Chinese lenders, and it's also shifted in scale. So as you say, the kind of multi-billion-dollar projects that had multi-decade, return of investment horizons they seem to be over for a while anyway. But in what we're seeing instead is smaller projects, but also an expansion of projects, and an expansion of lenders. So it's not that the Chinese are withdrawing from the infrastructure game, it's that the infrastructure landscape itself is shifting.
That's right. It's definitely a new era in Chinese infrastructure financing in Africa and around the world. As you pointed out, Cobus, it has not gone away. Now the loans are in the tens of millions and in the low hundreds of millions of dollars. They are focused on projects that have much tighter feasibility studies, a much faster path to return on investment. So toll-based projects, fee-based projects, things like data centers, mobile networks, toll roads that generate revenue much faster and that also can be incorporated into new funding models like the equity stake for the Lekki port in Lagos, which the China Harbor Engineering Company took a $220 million equity stake in, or the Nairobi Expressway, the $500 million Nairobi Expressway, I should point out, built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation in the Kenyan capital that will be repaid with tolls. So lots of new models, lots of innovations. Let's get some perspectives today on infrastructure, financing, what's going on in Nigeria specifically. And for that, we are thrilled to have on the show our old friend Ovigwe Eguegu, who is a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. Ovigwe is normally based in Nigeria, but today he joins us from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. A very good afternoon to you, Ovigwe.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
It's wonderful to have you on the show. We've been a longtime follower and fan of your work. By the way, everybody, if you'd like to see some of Ovigwe's earlier China-Africa writings, we've got it on the site. He's done some excellent work for us. I'll put those links in the show note. Ovigwe, you've been closely following the comments of Transportation Minister Rotimi Amaechi. Help us provide some context to what he meant when he said the Chinese are no longer funding, and what are the implications for Nigeria?
Yeah, I think, first of all, that comment is largely an expression of the Nigerian government frustration, with China in terms of infrastructure financing, because you would recall, in going back to when President Buhari came into office, he made a lot of big promises to deliver on projects that have been long-standing, that the country has had proposals for instance, like the Mambila hydropower plant. There's also other big projects like the AKK pipeline, and then there's Lagos-Kano Expressway that has about 800, kilometer gaping hole that nothing is still the work has not be completed. So of course it's election next year, and the government of course is looking at these projects not just in terms of the economic impact and how they can drive in economic productivity and development, but also as a report card. Right. So if you're in Nigeria, and you know that we're in full election mode, the conventions are coming, and delegates are going to be asking questions to the ruling party and all of the cabinet members. What have you done in the last 4 years? I mean, if you count the first tenure, 8 years, in terms of all of these promises that you've made. So I think one aspect that needs to help that will help contextualize what Honorable Mr. Rotimi Amaechi was talking about is just the fact that several of these projects that they hoped at least would have gotten to an advanced stage or even completed by the time by the time Buhari's 8 year runs out are still not be delivered. And not just the fact that they're not being delivered, we don't even know when and if these projects are going to to be delivered. So that's both, like I said, the sense of frustration and also this lack of, I would say, a lack of awareness of the future, of what the future really holds, because they know that other partners might very unlikely to actually commit the kinds of funds that that the Nigerian government is looking at. For instance, talking about railway connectivity in southern Nigeria, and the price tag is about $11.1 billion. Where on earth is Nigeria going to get that amount of money from? So I think that's something that the Nigerian government, particularly the infrastructure minister, they have to keep thinking about. And right now, it just doesn't seem, from the studies you cited, and also all of the trends we're looking, that China at the moment wants to part away with those kind of large amount of money. Maybe if we go back to the FOCAC document, the action plan, there was words and commitments in terms of concessional financing, but it just doesn't seem as easy as it used to be in the past, and that's the kind of reality that Nigerian government and several African governments now have to face.
Speaking of FOCAC, that just reminded me that Ovigwe and his colleague Eguegu from Development Reimagined did fantastic writing for SIRE last year, unpacking some of the issues around FOCAC. So that's up on the SIRE website, and yeah, really worth reading. Ovigwe, following up on that, so where does this leave Nigeria's, kind of railway dreams? Was the underlying kind of implication of the minister's comments that Nigeria is going to have to give up on some of these plans, or are there kind of other ways forward? I know that Nigeria has been shopping these projects around European finances as well, but I'm not sure with how much success.
I think when we're talking about Nigeria's financing plan, one of the major things that needs to come into that discussion is, do we really have a financing strategy? Do we have a strategy to attract financing, whether from China, or for Europe? And if you read the article you mentioned in The Guardian, the infrastructure minister was saying we're now looking to Europe to get financing for this project. What do you mean by Europe? Are you referring to European Development Bank, Infrastructure and Development Bank? Are you referring to commercial lenders? Who exactly are you going to meet in Europe? Europe is not one entity. So the fact that there's no specificity around alternative just goes to show that the government still lacks a strategy in terms of financing. Because if we do have alternatives, he would not just say Europe. He would go specifically to list exactly who in Europe, for instance, we're going to get the financing from. So maybe he's looking at the global gateway, and that has aroused a lot of excitement on the continent, even in Abuja, because of course the issue of we having alternative financing partners has been one of the major demand, calling on Western lenders, creditors to step up, but it's not exactly clear if it's exactly the global gateway which the European Union and European countries are talking about. That's what the finance the infrastructure minister means by Europe, or maybe he's talking about bilaterals, maybe you want to approach the UK, for instance, or France or Germany to say give us money for infrastructure. And if we're looking by recent history, that's very unlikely. So I think in terms of where we're going to go forward, or how we're going to go forward when it comes to financing, what the Nigerian government really needs to do, and one gap it needs to close, is to really come out to at least develop a very clear financing strategy. And when that strategy is in play, I don't think we will be talking with the kind of language we're hearing from the government today, but what you see will be more action, more announcements, more direct engagement from Nigeria, and of course, and that the partners that they have in mind.
Well, if they are going to count on Europe for that funding, which is, again, what they said, as you rightfully pointed out in the Guardian article, they're going to have to be very patient, because it looks like the plans for Europe to finance infrastructure as part of Global Gateway that they wanted to announce before the February 17th Europe-Africa summit have run into some problems. Germany apparently is balking, saying that some of the project plans are not set yet. Hungary, Portugal, and Finland are also not on board. France, who has the rotating presidency right now, is trying to get everything sorted before the 17th. But Ovigwe, as you pointed out, Europe is a giant entity. So just saying Europe is really going to be problematic simply because getting all member states on board for this might take some time. Let's do something now very fun. And I'm really glad that I've got the both of you here. Let's see, January and even into last week, there's just been a flurry of webinars and conferences and news all focused on China-Africa infrastructure. And I'm going to start in Kenya, but then we're going to go to the United States, and we're going to hear from lots of different stakeholders from across Africa. And I've got these sound bites, and I've been quoting these sound bites in our daily newsletter, in our China-Africa brief that goes out to our subscribers. But I thought it would be fun to extract some of these sound bites, play them for you guys, and have you riff off of them, okay? First, let's go to Nairobi. Joe Machiro, who is the Cabinet Secretary for the Ministry of Information, Communication, and Technology. He's an outspoken politician, a really fun guy to watch. And he's really a very passionate advocate for transparency and making information available to the public. In fact, it's his office that created the tenders.co.ke portal, which is a model for all developing countries on how to make government procurement contracts available to the public. So you go to tenders.co.ke, you type in the contract, and there is everything you want to know. If it's in your neighborhood, if you want to see the terms, the interest rates, it's amazing. By the way, that's also in accordance with Kenyan law. However, there is one contract in particular that is not on tenders.co.ke, and that is the $3.2 billion standard gauge railway contract with the China Exim Bank. Muchero, he is now the third high-ranking Kenyan government official to insist that the standard gauge railway contract remain secret and not available for the public to view. If you guys recall from last year, we started talking about this. Attorney General Kihari Karuki, he said a lawsuit that's now before the Mombasa High Court brought by two civil society activists is, and these are his words, incurably defective. And he called on the court to dismiss what he described as a, quote, frivolous case. Okay, that's excuse number one. Excuse number two came from Kenya's Transportation Minister, Joseph Njoroge, and he said that revelations of the contract's details would, and again, this is a quote, endanger national security and injure foreign relations. Okay, that's excuse number two. Now, Muchero last week appeared on the nationally televised morning radio show The Situation Room on Spice FM, and he was asked by host Eric Latif about the SGR contract and why the government is refusing to publicize the details when it's doing so with all the other procurement agreements. Let's listen into that conversation, and then Ovigwe and Cobus, I'd like to get your reaction.
It's in fact, there's even a case in court. We've been saying we want to get the details of the SGR contracts, and we'd like to know what exactly the details of that contract are, but still unable to get it.
So how do you answer? You know the government itself, just like yourself. There are contracts that you sign that say this is confidential, this is national security. There are all those levels. Mm-hmm. And even in the access to information law, there are all those requirements. So for instance, if, and this is hypothetical, I have not seen that contract, but if we were given a better deal than another country, and China doesn't want that country to know, and then we go and we publicize it everywhere, then nobody will ever give us any information. Because then even us, we can't keep secrets as a country.
What did we do to get a better deal? Maybe that's the detail that we want to know.
So I'm not saying that that's the case.
We
I'm
know,
just
it's
saying
hypothetical.
That those could be the reasons why Kenya has agreed with China or whoever it is that some of these things should be kept secret.
Ovigwe, I mean, that is literally got to be the worst excuse and the worst hypothetical I've ever seen. If you get a better deal, and what happens if China knows? And as Eric Latif pointed out, well, that's a thing that I think the Kenyan public would want to know. But there you have it. 3 different senior level officials, 2 ministers, 3 excuses as to why the SGR contract needs to stay secret. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, for me, I think the responsibility to transparency lies with the national government, right? Because every so often, when we're talking about the issue of transparency, China gets dragged into the conversation. From my understanding, that China sets its terms and go into negotiations, and if those negotiations, if the national law requires transparency, of course the Chinese they can't tell the government you shouldn't obey a national law to move ahead with your transparency require commitments to your citizens. So I think the issue in Kenya, or the SGR in particular, slowly it has really become clear that it is the government of Kenya that has the responsibility to publish, loan agreement. The borrower has the responsibility, not the creditor. And it's good that's the conversation we're having now. That's for a start. But specifically with the SGR, or even just about any state, contract for that matter, if a government actually has a clause in a particular deal that it should not publish the full agreement or the contract, I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And by my understanding, again, Kenyan law requires the government to publish all of its contracts. So what the government of Kenya can do, for instance, is publish the contract, but if certain parts are very sensitive, quote unquote, for their national security, you can redact that out of the publication. At the end of the day, people know all of the terms, but whatever is specific to national security, and that is not, it's actually for the government to decide, which is weirdly enough, that's the case. The government and the state decide what is national security. If the public still wants, then of course they can activate the Attorney General and say, well, let's see everything redacted. Every government in the world has the ability or even the attitude of keeping certain things secret. That's why every so often we see in the US, for instance, they say a president is coming into power and they promise to publish previously classified documents. So, and if Kenya, for instance, has a period of say maybe 10 years or 15 years after a project, you must publish everything unredacted. That could also still help. But from my perspective as a Nigerian, and my understanding of the SGR and even international negotiations, if the national law requires the government to publish a contract, then the government ought to publish that contract. But if in the contract it reached certain agreements that are sensitive to its national interest or national security, then those specific clause can be redacted. And that's just my opinion of the situation.
Cobus, you wrote about this subject this week in a column, specifically about the issue of Cabinet Secretary was saying. What's your take on it?
Well, kind of this comes in, in the wake of a lot of discussion internationally about loan transparency, and a lot of that criticism has gone to China. But as a lot of lending experts that we've spoken with have pointed out, that as many loan contracts from Western lenders are just as opaque, and in many cases, China actually uses Western law as a basis to make their contracts more opaque. So this is a big problem, and particularly in a case like in South Africa recently, which is going through this kind of massive kind of investigation into official corruption during the Jacob Zuma era. There's it's very corrosive in terms of breaking down trust between the population and the state. So it really is kind of good for everyone if these loans are publicized, and particularly also if all kind of government loans are then kind of also stored in some kind of shared database. So the Bretton Woods Committee, which is this very high level kind of I guess it's difficult to say how to they're like very prominent kind of economists and kind of academics and former bank presidents and so on, that kind of basically blue sky thinking for the Bretton Woods institutions. So the World Bank and the IMF. They recently published this report in which they put forth a whole bunch of suggested reforms to boost transparency, and it makes for really interesting reading. Some of those reforms would be very interesting and would definitely make a difference. Like, for example, they suggested having the full disclosure of government lending linked to the rating of that economy by ratings agencies like like S&P, for example. So all of those are really interesting, but it also has these kind of fatal flaws, among others, that they suggested that all of this that the kind of platform for housing all of these loan contracts and making them all public should be the OECD, which I think would immediately kind of draw lots of suspicion from China and probably would make Chinese actors like the state banks, for example, not want to participate. So I say so it's at the same time we're in this moment where all of this stuff is being discussed, but it's also at a moment where I think it still is very much kind of skewed in terms of Western institutions wanting to police the transparency of everyone else without doing these kind of fundamental reforms of their own legal systems that frequently enable some of this transparency to happen, the lack of transparency to happen.
And it's so interesting that Bretton Woods Committee report came out the same week and in the same month, that there's just, again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, just been a flurry of discussion in think tanks and at policy seminars and in the media as well. And normally the discussion of this in the U.S. media is so reductionist, like what we saw with Trevor Noah on The Daily Show and his BS take on China and Africa. And, I've ranted on that in previous shows, so I won't start on that one again. But there was a really great discussion. If you want to hear what it sounds like when Americans actually get serious to talk about this, go check out National Public Radio's Studio 1A program, and they interviewed Professor Deborah Browdigam, Professor Anita Plummer from Howard University, and our friend Jude Moore from the Center for Global Development. And they did a half-hour show that was just fantastic on the topic. And now I'd like to play a couple sound bites from you guys, again, talking about the discourse in the United States, where there is a lot of anxiety right now about Chinese infrastructure spending, the Belt and Road, China in general. So let's go over to Palo Alto, California at Stanford University. And there was a seminar that was held by the Hoover Institute there featuring Jendai Fraser. Now, Jendai is a former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, which made her basically the top diplomat for Africa during the George W. Bush administration. She's very well known in the U.S. policy space through her work at the Council on Foreign Relations and also at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Last month, Hoover held a webinar entitled China's Sharp Power in Africa, where Jendai spoke about the concerns about the very issue that Joe Machiro's comments arise regarding the lack of transparency in China's infrastructure development finance mechanisms in Africa. You'll also hear in her comments the real angst that a lot of U.S. stakeholders have today about the Chinese in Africa and whether they're even up to meet the challenge.
Often when we think about China and its economic footprint in Africa, we do think about it as a positive towards development. Obviously the continent needs infrastructure development to grow. And so we sort of debate this thing at a 60,000 foot perspective, saying, well, China's doing good because it's bringing infrastructure. African countries want the Chinese to invest because, the West aren't actually filling that gap, and local companies don't yet have the capacity at scale to fill that need of great infrastructure development. But what your papers do is really allow us to dig into the nature of the relationships and dig into the nature of the infrastructure development project. I like to call it China's debt financing development approach in Africa, and really look at the modus operandi and with greater nuance and a critical eye about how, in fact, China is moving so rapidly and what impact that has on society, on the relationship between local or national stakeholders and their government, the relationship between China and these African countries, And then really on the international standards for financing these infrastructure, whether digital or transportation infrastructure projects. The subsidies that are coming from the Chinese government to support often state-owned enterprises, and that the nature of those contracts are often unsolicited. And so these projects, which are being pushed by Chinese companies onto these national governments that don't necessarily reflect national priorities, I think is really something that needs to be paid attention to, as well as the single source procurement, non-competitive single source procurement, and the timed loans, so that if the Chinese government gives a loan, then you also have to use Chinese contractors, which again undermine local contracting companies and of course is unfair competition. And then finally, confidentiality clauses, increasing that non-transparency. And so really the opacity of the contracts and of the financing arrangements for these big infrastructure projects are leading to, in fact, deeper corruption and opportunities for corruption. And so corrupting of officials in these societies. It also, I think, speaks to the nature of the relationship between the Chinese government and the African government, in that there's a tremendous asymmetry, right? There's a tremendous asymmetry when most of the financing for these projects are coming from Chinese-owned banks, and these governments are taking it in with all of these clauses which aren't being open to the public, aren't being debated. They don't have as much negotiating power over them. And the Chinese government has this fine print where they can just cancel the contracts. And so that brings, I think, significant pressure.
So she referenced two papers that her other panelists delivered, and we're going to hear from one of those other panelists shortly. Sorry that the sound bites are rather long, but I really want to give these experts and these stakeholders the breadth and the time to be able to express their opinions on these issues, so that, Ovigwe, you can tell us, what did you hear in Jen Dai's statement and the anxiety that she has about the nature of Chinese engagement in Africa when it comes to infrastructure financing? What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah. First of all, I think she's asking good questions, which from a US perspective, because if you look at leading think tanks or even scholars in the US, and when they discuss these issues, it's always one of two things. So you have people like Deborah Broughtingham that really provide the nuance and say, for instance, this confidentiality issues is not exclusively Chinese, but that has been a long-standing industry standard, right? And the response to that is, okay, so even if the Chinese are following the US standard, that doesn't make it right. And to a large extent, that is true, because if A does something bad and B is doing something bad, then B is just as culpable. That doesn't mean we can't have a different system. We can't have a more transparent system. And it goes back to what what Cobus was saying about new submission from what I can't remember the organization he mentioned again, that is trying to change the rules on how, or new frameworks on how international financing is done. But one of my problem with the US's position, or US experts' position on this issue, is they do not have skin in the game, in the sense that it is not the US that is taking out these loans. It is not US citizens that have to repay these loans. It is Africans that are taking these loans through their government. So they do not have the position to explain to us what should be our attitude going into engagement with China. A lot of times, we talk about democracy. We've elected these officials. If we can trust these officials to develop fine documents like Agenda 2063, why can't we trust them to reach sensible agreements on behalf of their citizens? But in many cases, we don't trust our leaders in these negotiations because we don't trust the system that gives us these leaders. We don't trust our democratic processes. We don't trust our elections, and of course, we don't. And by extension, we doubt the competency and I would say the not only the wherewithal, but also the position that these leaders hold when they're in conversation. Secondly, from my perspective, is many of the central bank leaders or finance ministers, these are former IMF people, former World Bank experts. When they go into these negotiations, there's also this concern that, of course, you are a minister today, you definitely would be out of office in four years. The attitude that they go into those negotiations with, is it one where they are going to think about their own future, say, okay, when I'm out of office, am I going to get consulting gigs? Am I going to get juicy positions? If I hold certain position attitude towards the IMF, for instance, or towards China. So many of the problems that the US has with Chinese, it seems to have with China-Africa relations, particularly when it comes to lending, Africans ourselves, we hold these fears as well. We hold these suspicions as well. It is just the fact that when you do not have great alternatives, you want to be very careful by when you're dealing with what seems like the only big option you have. And it's not as if we don't know these things. I mean, from my perspective, I've been very privileged to talk to some people who have engaged with whether bilaterals or multilaterals in terms of in terms of financing. And it's very clear, the main problem Africa really faces, and that's what the US side is not capturing, is that there is a real concern about what are you going to bring to the table if we start taking up some of these issues. And even when the US is coming up with B3W and Global Gateway, it still isn't clear what exactly they want to do with Global Gateway. We don't know what the European Union had years to prepare for the summit for next 2 weeks. They postponed it 2020, 2021 with COVID and all of that. Now it's happening in 2022. And even next 2 weeks, they are still unprepared. So what have they been doing all this time? How can you really build trust in African governments or in Africans that Europe can actually meet these challenges when in 2 years you can't even get your act together to say, this is the deal we're going to present to Africans, or this is our position on these issues, or what we're going to offer. You Africans, look at it and tell us if you want to move with us.
Yeah, 1,000% agree. The issue of the US not having skin in the game, it's so true, because it's also. So they don't have skin in the game in relation to the loans and the people having to pay the loans back, but they also have no experience of having to live with the lack of that infrastructure. They have no experience of what it means for the lives of people and the economy to, for example, have no kind of like efficient connection between two major cities, or being stuck in traffic for 8 hours at a time, or all of those problems. So it's kind of, it's very frustrating for me when frequently Western commentators are so okay with underdevelopment, with systemic underdevelopment, and then kind of cast a lot of suspicion, sometimes warranted suspicion, on the particular kind of infrastructure that's being planned to solve that problem, but zero kind of interest in the problem itself. So that is upsetting. Also, kind of as she pointed out, yes, after the power relationship is extremely asymmetric, but that is the reality, the existential reality of being Africa in the world. Africa's power relationship with everyone is asymmetric, and that is one of the reasons why the China-Africa relationship happened in the first place. Is because kind of like you would have. African countries, decade in and decade out, had to deal with how much, quote, interest a particular administration in Washington or in Europe has in them, like what particular form that interest takes, like how it's filtered through whatever kind of Cold War and post-Cold War strategic preoccupations they were. So for example, you have a situation where the World Bank is for a while, in the 60s and 70s, interested in hard infrastructure, and then at some stage there's this kind of change of heart, and there's a kind of a new wind kind of blowing through the World Bank, and suddenly it's now infrastructure's passé, So then the countries just have to be like, okay, well, I guess no infrastructure then, So it's that kind of like power dynamic has characterized Africa's relationship with the world throughout history. And for now, for Western commentators to suddenly be like suddenly waking up to that reality now is a bit dumb for me.
Cobus, you brought up the Bretton Woods Committee report earlier in the program, and it seems like this is, again, a call for the Chinese to play by the rules set up by the OECD and by the traditional partners. And one of the frustrations that we hear over and over again from the US and from Europe is that China isn't playing by the rules. Even in the G20 with the debt service suspension initiative, even though China was living by the letter of the law and the letter of the agreements, they were not living by the spirit of it because they weren't communicating with other members of the G20 about the different debt restructuring deals and debt deferrals that they were doing with various African countries. So this is a criticism that we hear over and over again, is that they're playing by a different set of rules. We hear this in the contracts as well, the widespread use of commercial loans made by policy banks. This is something that is very, very upsetting and foreign to U.S., European, Japanese lenders, where concessional loans traditionally come out of the policy banks, not commercial loans. The use of offshore parastatal collateralization. This is something that came up with the Entebbe airport issue. This idea that they require a large offshore collateral agreement for a fund to be there just in case the loan goes south. They can then draw from this collateralized escrow account, if you will. The resource for infrastructure deals are not things that are done by the U.S. and Europe. And the insistence, of course, as we've talked about throughout this program, on the strict non-disclosure clauses in contracts like the one for the SGR in Kenya. Now, on this point, we have another comment from the Hoover Institute's webinar on China's sharp power. This one is from Zambian anti-corruption activist Ruben Lifuka, who is, by the way, also the vice chair of the board of Transparency International. And he says that China's practices are not helping to improve governance, both in his country and across Africa.
The problem is China would like to extend its commercial interests in countries like Zambia, but playing by their own rules away from home. So not adhering to public procurement procedures because of the nature of the contracts that are entered to, not being open and transparent to allow for this freedom of expression and the scrutiny that civil society, the media, and others would like to have if they had greater information on the nature of the contracts, etc. So it would like to participate in our economies, but on their terms, under their rules, and not necessarily the local rules. Now, if you look at the fight against corruption in China and what is happening elsewhere, I see a serious policy incoherency here. On one hand, we're being told China is fighting corruption. And one expects that the state-owned enterprises, which meet all the requirements of the Chinese government, including the aid code, whatever it is that are put in place, will do the same in foreign jurisdiction. However, China's well-known policy is that of non-interference in domestic affairs of recipient countries. That to me suggests that China will be less than inclined to take an active role in fighting corruption. Right by that policy, it is not quite inclined. This hands-off approach seemingly just makes China not too keen to get its hands dirty in dealing with domestic affairs of Zambia or helping Zambia deal with the corruption that we're grappling with, not just in the construction sector, but elsewhere. But what is also worrying to me is that there seems to be this notion that the Chinese companies, like others, would say, well, we are corrupt because we found a corrupt environment. But a corrupt environment should never serve as a justification for one's own corrupt behavior. If Chinese companies are living up to higher standards of probity in the way they do business, this needs to be demonstrated in the norms that they bring to their workspaces, in the way they deal with government officials, in the way they compete for projects, avoiding collusion, avoiding all the unfair business practices. But we're not seeing that. It's almost like going with the flow because we found a dirty environment, so there's nothing wrong with us being part of this environment, and not standing out and being that beacon of hope that we can clean up the sector.
Ovigwe, I mentioned that China has a double standard when it comes to sanctions. They don't like it when the U.S. does it, but they don't mind doing it themselves. And Ruben talks about a double standard on the question of corruption, that at home, Xi Jinping has been really adamant from day one since he took office back in 2012. Corruption has been the thing and cracking down on corruption, but yet overseas, it's hands off. What's your reaction to Ruben's statement there?
Yeah, I would say to a large extent I agree with him on the issue of non-interference and also in the issue of government themselves, the corrupt environment not being a justification for corruption. That is very, very true. I mean, for someone like me, I grew up in southern Nigeria, particularly, with the oil-rich, delta, and I saw corruption and collusion, everything that Ruben described with the oil companies. In fact, till date, we are still taking some of those companies to court. There was a large, victory over Shell that was announced last year. So when people say China doesn't play by the rules, I often laugh and say, well, maybe the rules that you're not familiar with, because some of the practices that so-called the rules of the trade is to just work with the environment and see how you can manipulate your way through institutions and structures that you can manipulate, and that is very much by the rules. I mean, the unwritten rules that we might not like, but that's just the way the game is the game. However, on the issue of corruption, where I agree with Ruben is the fact that if we as a continent, with all our countries and all of the problems, and we know for a fact that corruption is a major, major problem, then we have the responsibility to hold ourselves to account and hold all our partners to account in equal measure. Because if we do that, then it becomes not only better for us as societies or as countries, but it shows our partners that we respect ourselves. And for that basis, and on that basis, they must respect us. If you catch maybe illegal Chinese miners, for instance, and you publish, write an article, we've seen it several times in Nigeria, you don't see in the government of China come to say, oh no, you cannot prosecute our citizens, blah blah blah. They get punished, and very often you even hear within China that people you repatriate back to China, they even get punished there even more, because they want to save face. They know that they are hanging on a very thin thread in many jurisdictions, in many countries, and they don't want the bad publicity. They can't deal with the bad press. It's not good for their image. It's not good for the soft power that they're trying to develop. So if that even gives Africa an opportunity to put China in a position where it holds itself to a higher standard and practice in African countries. But to achieve that, we have to first demonstrate that we respect our own laws, we respect our own people, and we respect our own national interests by holding ourselves to account. Because when you do that, then you cannot come into my country and you disrespect me. So I think Ruben has a very strong point, and that for me is something that is a conversation that to a large extent African countries, African citizens need to have with themselves.
But Ovigwe, I'll just challenge you on one point there, because if you've been following what we've been writing lately in this controversy that's been going on in Zimbabwe, where a group of 27 civil society organizations have called out Chinese mining companies for what they claim are abuses of power, of the forced relocation of people, of labor abuses, and lack of environmental impact assessments. The Chinese embassy in Harare and Xinhua and the state media apparatus have come at them like a ton of bricks, and they are firing back on all cylinders. So it's a real interesting dynamic of what's going on in Zimbabwe. When civil society does mount pressure on the Chinese, they do fight back.
Yeah, of course they will fight back, and they should fight back. But let facts be stronger than narrative. If we have the facts as civil society or as citizens, then let the facts speak. I know it is it's very easy, to take up issues. I can wake up tomorrow morning and just say, oh, this mining company in my community is not obeying ESG regulations, and just start a case. But at the end of the day, where is the evidence? Let's look at the evidence. And I really like the fact that even in my own country, Nigeria, when there was so much hysteria around debt and how much money was owed to China, and then the DMO, that's the Debt Management Office of Nigeria, published the figures, and that immediately destroyed to a large extent
fantastic
all of the narrative around it. In the same thing again, we saw with President Ichilema. He has published the figures, and you see from my perspective, I think it's very easy to bust these narratives out, to prove the narratives right, by just putting out the figures. with the only weapon that you have is just to put out all of the evidence. So whether in Zimbabwe or in Kenya or any African country, Nigeria, Ghana, let it not be narratives based, let it be fact based. If we have problems with the environment, if we have problems with lending, if we have problems, let the figures and the facts be the ultimate decider.
Cobus, let's hear from you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I actually don't have that much to add, but it's really important. The issue that Ovigwe mentioned of soft power, there is an issue here of African soft power as well, or then a lack of soft power, in the sense that if there is this narrative that Africa is such a corrupt place to do business, and that to do business there that you have no choice but to be corrupt, that itself becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if there were some kind of a very proactive kind of prosecution of the African officials who were involved in corrupt practices with foreign investors, if the kind of full weight of the law came at them, then that also sends its own message. So the situation isn't only that this kind of information should be disclosed. That is very important, but there should also be some kind of like follow up of that. To pull these people out of power, or to pull them out of society in some kind of way, and that frequently we don't see in African countries, and South Africa is case number one. It's been incredibly difficult to get the Zuma era officials and former President Zuma himself actually in court. They have fantastic legal teams. They throw like one kind of diversionary tactic after another at the courts, and it is this kind of very under-resourced kind of court system that needs to kind of catch up with people who have corruption-fueled legal help, and it's a tough process. So in some kind of way, for Africa to be consistently kind of proactive in coming after their own officials who are corrupt, that would in the end also have this kind of build a form of African soft power in the end, But yeah, no, that's very, very idealistic.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the idealism, and this is what we hear on webinars where analysts and academics talk in a very abstract way. But I'll tell you, as somebody who's done business here in Southeast Asia as a small to medium-sized enterprise who doesn't have any leverage over a client, for example, who literally will say to you, if you don't send me a commission, I'll take my business elsewhere. And you have no other choice if you want your business to move forward than to pay those commissions. So yes, the biggest companies in the world have the leverage to say, we're not going to engage in corruption. But when you are not the major corporations, so maybe not the state-owned enterprises, but a mid to small enterprise, you have no choice but to pay commissions, because that's just how you get things done. And that's been my experience here in Southeast Asia. It's been my experience in the Congo as well. So I think it's really easy to say you shouldn't be corrupt. But again, when the environment around you is that, you oftentimes have no choice if you want to get business done. That's just been my personal experience.
And just to follow up on that, you're right. Like it's much harder for smaller corporations, and the larger they get, the more empowered they get, and then they can say no, we don't participate in corruption. But then the other option is then to participate in lobbying, and to use massive amounts of lobbying money to essentially shape the legal system around their business priorities. So and that of course is depending on how you do it, it's completely legal, but it still is extremely problematic, and to somehow kind of like isolate that from the wider discussion about corruption is really disingenuous, because it's essentially, okay, it's corruption if you're small and weak, but when you reach a certain scale, then it's completely legit. It's just not right.
So I just need to apologize in advance to everybody listening to the show that we're going to go a little bit longer than we normally do, just because I've got 3 more great sound bites, and they're a little bit on the long side. But I really want you guys to hear the breadth, instead of a 10-second soundbite or a 15-second soundbite, to literally let these people kind of express themselves. So we're going to go a little bit longer than we normally do. Cobus and I will not do our typical end of show brief at the end, because I want to make sure that we respect your time and we get these sound bites in. Let's go back to the United States, and we're going to go to New York this time. And we've heard a lot of bad takes, as I talked about earlier, about the Chinese engagement in Africa from the U.S., from U.S. scholars, from U.S. analysts, and from the U.S. media. And so it's important that we also hear a more nuanced explanation for why Americans in particular feel the way they do about the Chinese in Africa. And again, because the U.S.-China dynamic is a very important phenomenon, that it is relevant. So the U.S. is not just any old country here. They do have a big impact on what's going on. So for that, let's go to a webinar that was held on January 20th by the New York-based nonprofit Network 2020 that featured an absolutely fascinating discussion between former Liberian Public Works Minister Jude Moore, an old friend of ours on the program, and Jennifer Hillman, who's a senior fellow for trade and international political economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. If you're not familiar with Jennifer's work, she's becoming an increasingly important analyst for research on the implications of China's Belt and Road on the U.S., and she wrote with a number of her colleagues a very important paper on the subject last March that I recommend you check out. I've put a link to that in the show notes. But for our purposes today, here are her 4 concerns. And again, it's a little bit of a longer soundbite, so bear with me, but it's really interesting. She lays out 4 concerns about lending infrastructure and the adverse impact of the Belt and Road.
The problem for the United States and the rest of the world is not the existence of the Belt and Road Initiative itself. Again, I would certainly agree with everything Judy has just said. Part of the reason why the Belt and Road Initiative got as far as it did is because China was filling a vacuum that the United States and others had created. We had, and largely, and to some degree, the multilateral development banks and others had largely walked away from funding a lot of this hard infrastructure. So, and again, China, it's not the existence of the Belt and Road, because it is definitely providing very much needed infrastructure in many places. The problem for the United States, and I think for the rest of the world, is the way in which China is going about it. And again, I'm going to just cite a couple of things that are particularly worrying. First is that it is undermining macroeconomic stability, because it is increasing the likelihood that a debt crisis is going to materialize over the coming years, because so many of these loans are at, on commercial terms, carrying, relatively high interest rates into countries that are already relatively impoverished, and they're funding fairly economically questionable projects that may or may not end up, creating or generating much return, at least not for many, many years to come. So that's one clear concern. The second one is obviously that China is now subsidizing very privileged market access for its own state-owned and sort of non-market-oriented Chinese companies, which means it will be triply hard for U.S. and other companies to try to come in and compete with those, because they're not going to be able to match either the speed or the price. They may be better on quality, on a lot of other things, but there's a real concern about this degree of market access. Thirdly, it has definitely been able to allow China to lock countries into these kind of Chinese ecosystems, particularly by pressing its technology and these preferred technical standards on all of these BRI recipients. I mean, it used to be in the telecommunications area, it was a little bit of kind of plug and play. You could buy one component from one place and another component from another, and you could build your own telecommunication systems. No longer. I mean, the standards are very much Huawei and ZTE standards. So you, again, locked others out and made it clear that it's not reliance on China just for the first installation. You're locking yourself into sticking with that Chinese ecosystem for, sort of a very long time. It is clearly making it harder for the World Bank and other traditional lenders to insist on the high standards that they typically do insist on in terms of transparency, good governance, environmental impact assessments. A whole series of rigorous environmental and social impact assessments are completely being ignored. And it makes it harder now for the World Bank to come back in and ask for those high standards if everyone can turn to China. And again, and lastly, is that it does leave countries more susceptible to Chinese political pressure because of the dominant Chinese presence in these markets.
Wow. There you go, Ovigwe. That's a lot of American anxiety all packed up into 3 minutes. Give us your take.
Yeah, well, on macroeconomics stability that she mentioned, that's definitely a concern because if the economies are not growing fast enough, issue of repayment, is very likely to be a problem. How do you solve that? Offer us a better alternative, because so what should we do? We shouldn't build roads, we shouldn't build bridges, we shouldn't build harbors. We can't, and that's what Cobus was even alluding to earlier on. There is this. Their fear of China is higher than their fear of their recognition of underdevelopment in Africa. So we should be okay with underdevelopment just so they shouldn't have to worry too much about Chinese influence. Number 2, number 3, and number 4 are not African problems. Those are American problems. Issue of whether they have political influence or whether they we are being locked into some form of situation where American companies can't compete. That's not really our in Nigerian or African problem. It's our problem it's American problem in the sense that those profits and those businesses they're not domiciled here. They don't pay. Well, they might pay taxes, but it's from a political standpoint, it's not necessarily our problem. Where I do agree with what she was saying is this: we don't want to live in a world where weak and fragile states or struggling states like we have a ton of in the continent of Africa do not have options. That is a nightmare if you don't have power or if you're a weak state in the international system. So the priority for us as Africans should be to have a system that is truly loaded with options, whether for financing roles or for PPPs, structural financing or concessional financing. Whatever the model, we want options, simple and short.
I share her concern about the possibility of countries again kind of losing their options, right? Particularly around kind of IT and internet provision. But what we've seen in tracking kind of Huawei on the ground in places like South Africa is like if they're operating in an environment like in South Africa where kind of where there is competition legislation and there is the governments are interested in having an open market and fostering competition. Then we see, for example, South African telecoms, they use a lot of Huawei stuff, but they also are at pains when you speak with them that they don't want to be dependent only on Huawei. So in that sense, they're really echoing what she's saying, but in practice, they have been able to kind of to mix Huawei stuff and other stuff. And I mean, I'm sure kind of in certain countries and in certain projects that might not be true. Kind of they kind of face a lot of pressure to go only with Chinese standards. But we've seen, kind of on the level of, for example, cell phone provision, that is what the companies do. They do mix, Western stuff and Korean stuff and Chinese stuff together in their networks. That's what they prefer to do.
So Jennifer was talking with Jude, and we're going to close the rest of our show with 2 long sound bites from Jude Moore. Jude, again, if you're not familiar with him, he is the former Liberian Public Works Minister and now a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. Very outspoken on China-Africa issues and on infrastructure topics in particular, given his background. Jude makes the point that the U.S. and Europe may not like what China is doing in Africa, but from an African point of view, and Ovigwe, this speaks to what you were talking about. Some of this is our problem, and some of this is not our problem. He says the presence of the Chinese on the continent is forcing the legacy powers like the U.S. and Europe to take the kind of action that they otherwise wouldn't do.
I think that, in a way, China has won the argument with the West, and the argument was that we need to finance infrastructure because Global Gateway and B3W are always presented as alternatives to what the Chinese are doing. And you have to remember that if they had been financing infrastructure from the beginning, there wouldn't have been even space for the Chinese to arise and do that. So that's a good thing. The second thing is that we're going to see, and we're beginning to see that. So, for example, before the war started in Ethiopia, there was a big sale in licenses. And there were 2 two main competitors for those licenses. One was MTN out of South Africa, and MTN was backed by the Silk Road Fund from China. And one was Vodafone out of Kenya, and it was backed by the USDFC. So all of a sudden, we're beginning to see a competition now in terms of providing financing that did not exist before. If that had occurred, say, 5 years ago, it would have simply been the Chinese component that would be there. But now we have real competition for that. We're also seeing that US firms are now building data centers across Africa. Initially, a lot of that stuff was being done by Huawei, but we're seeing Raxio, we're seeing Digital Realty, we're seeing Equinix, huge US firms taking large positions in data. And so, and the final thing is almost every African tech unicorn has used US VCs, right? It's US money going into them that gave them that valuation. So I think B3W and Global Gateway can be competitors in certain sectors, and we're already beginning to see that. And that is a good problem to have. As an African, I want to be able to go to the market for money to finance and have three competing infrastructure financing funds out of which I can pit them against each other and get what's best. So I think it's a good start. Hopefully, we will see some announcements soon of real physical projects.
So Jude made so many great points in this webinar. I really recommend that you go and check it out. Again, I'll put the links to all of this in the show notes. I couldn't play all of them just because we'd be here for the next 3 hours and it would be dreadfully boring. But let me just play one final point that Jude made, and then we'll get Ovigwe's and Cobus's take on it. The fact is that China is lending to countries that otherwise wouldn't have access to the capital markets. So for all of the whining and whinging that we hear about Chinese development financing that goes on in Washington and elsewhere, they are providing a service that the US, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans just aren't willing to do. And that is something that's really important. So from the point of view of the African policymaker that's looking at their options, Jude makes the point, and Cobus has said this over and over again, oftentimes, it's the Chinese or nothing.
China is the largest bilateral lender. For example, if Liberia or Togo wanted to borrow from the US government, there is really no mechanism for the US to do government-to-government lending. You might get money through the World Bank or the African Development Bank where the US contributes, but where the US is directly lending to countries, that's something the US has stopped doing for a while. What China, I think between 2019 and 2024, 64% of interest payments to bilateral lenders across the world were going to China. So China was lending to countries with weak credit history. There are only about 33 African sovereigns who have a sovereign rating who can go to the financial markets and issue debt. And so China is lending to these countries with weak credits, right? And so what China ended up doing was building those contracts in such a way that it got repaid. One of them Jennifer spoke about was establishing escrow accounts in banks where China had control. So, for example, if there was a mine that was given in this infrastructure for minerals deal, that mining project would have an escrow account in a Chinese-controlled bank. And when payments went, they went to that account first, right? So these were some stringent means that China put in there, but sometimes they were over the top. For example, the Kenyan government is in court today because activists are suing the Kenyan government to show the terms of agreement for the Mombasa rail. And up to today, it hasn't been produced. So I think in a lot of instances, these agreements are not a deal. These agreements would probably, if there were options on the table, most countries would probably ask for a bit different deal. And I think the demand from the Chinese side would be different, but simply because of the absence of this. And quickly, before I stop, it's like between now and mid-century, half of the 2 billion increase in global population is expected to occur in Africa. As it stands, the population of the continent is already putting stress on existing infrastructure. Africa is going to continue to need infrastructure. And if there is no alternative, then it doesn't matter how crappy the terms are that the Chinese present, that's what's going to happen. If my house is on fire and my neighbor shows up, I'm not going to be like, hey, that's dirty water you're using to put out my fire. Like, if he's the only one who shows up to put out the fire, then that's what I'm going to accept. So I think we need alternatives. We need the World Bank and the multilateral development banks to begin to finance infrastructure, hard infrastructure again. We need bilaterals to finance hard infrastructure.
Jude just has a wonderful way of making this so accessible and so understandable and to the point, and really articulating a strong African voice on this. Ovigwe, what is your take and your thoughts on Jude's comments?
In fact, I was nodding my head in agreement all through, his comments, because I strongly agree with the issue of options and the urgency. Now, that urgency, I think, is really, really missing from the conversation, because, for instance, let's even go back. Let's not go back too far. Let's look at the recent events happening in West Africa with all of the coups. Every single country's military, or in every single situation, the military justifies its coup by saying underdevelopment, poverty, corruption, underdevelopment, poverty, corruption. Maybe in Mali, for instance, and Burkina Faso, throwing the issue of security. But a lot of the insecurity is fueled by long-standing underdevelopment in areas where people have not even seen a tarred road for decades. In fact, they probably never even had one since time began. So when governments in West Africa are saying we have to take collective action to improve the situation in respect for democracy and rule of law and all of those very important things, one of the major aspects that is missing from these pronouncement coming from ECOWAS is that they have to input accountability. I mean, accountability here is substantive accountability, delivering public services, delivering housing, delivering on roads, hospitals, education. But they're not going to say that because they know many of them don't even have that in their priorities, and those who do have this problem of financing. How are they going to pay for these things? I don't think any government in Africa, no matter how corrupt, no matter how irresponsible, if they know that they can go to the US tomorrow and say, see, we need a full, for instance, in Nigeria, a full Northeast development plan, because we've come to realize with study after study that it is underdevelopment that is the core of the insecurity and violence we're facing in the Lake Chad Basin. We want to maybe finance really massive irrigation projects for in the Lake Chad, for Nigeria, for Cameroon, for Niger, for Chad. Are they going to get the money? Very unlikely they are going to get the money for that. So the urgency and not only the urgency, the fact that many people in the West don't understand that the development is not just about can you repay the loan? Can you is it what percentage are you lending? Those are financial issues. Those are economic bubble questions. For many of these African countries, it's about legitimacy. It's about the issue of accountability. It's about the issue of them being able to look at their citizens and said, we are able to do this and we're able to do that. So, because government cannot point to hard infrastructure, and I remember I was having this town hall in Kano in Nigeria, where we're talking about the Kano railway and all of that, and how it's going to improve development. And many of the farmers are actually very much in agreement. One farmer, and this is so interesting because this is someone who is not very educated and asked a very brilliant question. He said, I can go out to the street now and touch all of the railway that were built with Chinese financing. All of these Western companies that are talking, multilateral talking about, World Bank, IMF, we owe them so much money. Where is the railway we built with those monies? Where is the road we built with those monies? Where is the schools or the bridges or the ports we built with those money? And that's a very important question, because before China came into the scene, for many years we were still lending money from the IMF, but those were to balance budgets. They were not using them to build anything. So many people know that we owe the IMF, we owe the World Bank, but they can't point to anything in their immediate environment that we use with those to build with those monies. So for China, even if we have a problem or some problems in terms of the deals or the power inequality, people can actually go outside to touch what they built with those loans, but you can't do that for the multilaterals, and that's a major indictment on the arguments that they are making.
Yes, 1,000% agree. Yeah, this is what kind of like really frustrates me frequently about kind of Western responses to, for example, the crisis in Ethiopia. And admittedly, like frequently these Western countries have limited tools to exert pressure. But the way that, for example, that the Biden administration, the first thing that they did was to take Ethiopia off AGOA. The only thing that's going to get Ethiopia through its crisis is some form of development, right? Kind of like so much of conflict and kind of resource struggles in Africa has to do with this kind of like pervasive systemic underdevelopment. And so in that sense, that is the flip side of all of this kind of like Western complaints about China coddling dictatorships and willing to do business with these horrible governments, which sure, true. But at the same time, the only way to get into a better place is through some form of development, and therefore you frequently have to do business while it's still in crisis. To be able to say, kind of like the Biden administration does, like, oh, there's this horrible crisis happening, so we need to withdraw all opportunities for this country to make enough money to get themselves out of this crisis. There's a lot of this kind of like preoccupation with domestic ideas of what is right, rather than with kind of pragmatic actual attempts to try and solve the situation. And then frequently so much of the crisis, so much of the criticism of China, the flip side of that criticism is frequently to do with this kind of crazy pragmatism that China works with, which is frequently kind of really problematic. But in lots of ways, it also brings something to the table which allows some form of future kind of alternative to develop, which frequently the other alternatives don't.
Okay, we are well over our time, but I wanted to play all of these sound bites. We did a little bit of a different type of show today to take advantage of Ovigwe's breadth of knowledge on all these different issues. It was great to be able to dive into this the way that we did, simply because so much of the current narratives that we hear coming out of the US, the UK, Europe, elsewhere, even in Africa, places like Uganda, with the terrible reporting that came out of the Daily Monitor on their reporting on the Entebbe airport issue. It's really nice to be able to dive in with some really thoughtful people like we had in the soundbites, and of course with Ovigwe and Cobus as always. Ovigwe, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule in Addis Ababa. If people want to follow what you're reading and writing, you are very active on Twitter. Where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Always a pleasure to join you guys. They can follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn with my name at Ovigwe Eguegu. That's OVIGWE EGU.
Cobus, thank you so much for joining us. We don't do this very often, but remind everybody, what's your Twitter account these days?
I inadvisedly years ago chose Stadenesque. That's STADNESQUE.
It's so random, okay? And then our Twitter account is China AFR Project. So we have everything that's going on there. We're putting all of our stories up there. We put some quotes, we put a bunch of news, so go ahead and follow that. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition. Until then, I'm Eric Olander. For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. For more information about the China Africa Project, go to chinaafricaproject.com.